Buenas tardes, muchas gracias por acompañarnos. Este es el primer evento, el plato fuerte del festival. Tenemos el gran honor de recibir en esta edición del festival a una gran maestra del cine contemporáneo, la cineasta británica Sally Potter. Por favor, démosle un aplauso. Sally Potter comenzó a hacer películas en los años 70, películas experimentales, y bueno, desde entonces ha hecho varios largometrajes, cada uno con una propuesta estética innovadora, y quizá su película más conocida es la película Orlando de 1991 con Tilda Swinton, pero desde entonces también ha presentado la lección de tango, y este año en México tenemos el estreno de Ginger and Rosa. Ojalá se puedan quedar a la función más adelante. Tenemos dos proyecciones, una a las 7:15 y otra a las 10:30. Y bueno, también está con nosotros el periodista, crítico, a veces profesor Nick Roddick, que es un amigo también del festival, fue miembro del jurado de cortometrajes aquí del festival hace un par de años, y bueno, también nos va a acompañar para platicar con Sally Potter, para que conozcamos más de su obra, para que nos comparta también su experiencia, y también obviamente va a ser una plática abierta al público, así que no sean tímidos y pregunten lo que quieran. Le doy la palabra a Nick Roddick.
Thank you, Mara. Thank you all for coming out in this weather, which is more suited to the place that we come from. I gather it never rains here at this time of the year. Sally, welcome to Morelia. Thank you for agreeing to talk to us all this afternoon. I'd like to begin by, I don't know, do you ever Google yourself? Do you ever look yourself up on IMDb?
I definitely try and avoid Googling myself.
Well, I was just checking some dates this morning, and on IMDb it says Sally Potter, born, well, obviously, she is a director. For more trivia, click here. So we will get into the trivia now. How did that all come about? I mean, I gather you started making films at a very early age with a Super 8 camera?
A standard 8 camera when I was 14.
And what was it that, I mean, that must have been fairly unusual for somebody aged 14 in, the early 60s to choose that particular form of self-expression, or what was it drew you to telling stories through moving images to making films?
Well, I guess like many other people, I grew up loving the films that I saw, and I saw some wonderful films as a child. The Marx Brothers was one of my favourite. I thought of them as teachers in a way, anarchists, structuralists or something. Anyway, and then, but really the big moment for me was not about how I consumed cinema and how I experienced it, which I loved, but how I felt while I was producing it. So as soon as I picked up an 8mm camera and looked through the lens and began to feel what a frame did to what I looked at with my naked eye, I was completely enchanted and excited by what was possible. And really it just started there with making very, very small films. I just want to check, can everyone hear properly? It's all good? Okay, great.
Yeah. Just to pick you up on something you said there, what does a frame do? What was it that a frame did? How does a frame change the way you see something because you're looking at it through a viewfinder?
Well, the fascinating thing about a frame is that it starts to speak of what it leaves out. So the whole metaphysical relationship between what you're looking at and what you're deciding not to look at is the magical choice for a filmmaker. And people play with that sometimes, having their characters leave the frame and come back in and so on, and you begin to build an imaginary world around the frame. But not only does it do that, evoke what's outside the frame, but of course it also evokes the entire history of painting, composition, proportion. And then in film there are different kinds of frames, from the classic 4:3 Academy ratio to 16:9 to widescreen, and each of those frames starts to dictate different kinds of relationship inside the frame that you can explore too. So.
You also, I think, in your late teens, joined the London Filmmakers Co-op, which was an organisation which was very much committed to a certain kind of political cinema. And the politics of the Filmmakers Co-op was that the medium, the material itself, was as much a part of the political statement. Is that something you took into your later life as a film director?
Well, for those here who may not know what the Filmmakers Cooperative was in London, it was basically a space with some very rudimentary filmmaking equipment, an editing bench, an old camera, a projector, and eventually a printer and a processor. And people could join this cooperative if they wanted to become filmmakers for free, and learn through doing it, through making things in a very physical, hands-on way, could really learn how to become a filmmaker. And that's how I learned how to become a filmmaker. I did not go to film school. I left school at 16 with the expressed intent to become a director. But I really found out through the Filmmakers Cooperative that this philosophy of filmmaking at the Filmmakers Cooperative was very abstract, very anti-narrative. In fact, it was oppositional cinema of a very heady kind. And I experienced myself as a teenage girl in a curious kind of opposition to this opposition, in that I was interested in things that they often weren't. Nevertheless, I think this approach to filmmaking, which is very material, takes nothing for granted, and tries to, in a way, reinvent the language of cinema itself, was a fantastically good way of learning about filmmaking, in combination with simply sitting for hundreds and hundreds of hours of watching every kind of film from around the world, to the most abstract, tiny visual poems with no narrative at all, to the great Hollywood musicals, to Indian musicals, or every kind of filmmaking.
But you have also taken that over into your narrative filmmaking. You have characters. Well, the very first thing that happens in Orlando, I think, is Tilda Swinton addresses the camera. That's me, she says. You foreground the nature of filmmaking very much in Rage. So have you taken all that right through your career, or were there stages where you perhaps were content to tell a story in more traditional forms?
I think there are many reasons for wanting, as a filmmaker, to acknowledge and express a relationship with the medium. And I think one of the reasons for doing that is to feel that a story is not a given. There is no objective storyteller. There is always a subjective point of view. So when you break the fourth wall and say hello to the audience across it, you're in a way establishing a complicity of relationship. And that is a political act, because it's saying, I'm here, you are there, and we have these different places, we're having a conversation. I'm not the god of cinema who's hiding somewhere in the medium, hiding his or her authorship somewhere in the medium. So I think that was the motivation. In Orlando, it was about wanting to reproduce Orlando, which was based on the book by Virginia Woolf, the classic work by Virginia Woolf, in which she repeatedly addresses the reader directly. She makes the relationship with the reader. She develops a conversation with the reader, a complicity where you're in it together, looking at history and taking a fantastical walk through 4 centuries. And I wanted to find a cinematic equivalent of that voice. That's why Orlando looks out through the lens and addresses the audience.
I don't want to, but you've also directed opera, a production of Carmen, for example. You've directed theatre, you write your own scripts, you act in them, you produce probably. It's a picture. Do you take that same notion into other performing arts, the idea of encouraging the audience's complicity in the act of viewing?
Well, first of all, film is my first love. Opera is somewhere quite low down the list. But it was an interesting experience. But I think maybe opera is a precursor of film, in that it attempted before celluloid to be the first multimedia experience in a way. But the complicity, I think there's also a moment where one wants to simply accept the medium, and that's what I've done with Ginger and Rosa. There is deliberately no self-conscious reference to the fact that hey folks, we're watching a film. It really is saying, okay, this is the form, it's a story, it moves linearly through time, these are characters, these are actors pretending to be these people, and then enters into that world in a very loving way, I think.
I think we'll probably come back to this when we come to Ginger and Rosa, but it sounds like what you're saying is that having worked through these different ways of working with the image, you've found a confidence in the simplicity of a straightforward piece of storytelling with Ginger and Rosa, or is that too much of a simplification?
I'm not sure there's any such thing as a straightforward piece of storytelling, but I think that simplicity, it's a truism, but it's the hardest thing to achieve and it takes a long time to get there, and the more you strip things away, the more, in a way, naked you're prepared to be with a form, the more any flaws in it are exposed. So, and people tend to therefore cover things up a lot. And the attempt with Ginger and Rosa was to be naked in that way and accepting of the form.
I think that's what I meant, and you put it so much better. You made a series of short films, and then you made your first feature almost 30 years ago. 1982?
Don't ask me.
Some time ago. Gold Diggers. How did you come to make that? How did you make that transition from making short films, working with a filmmakers co-op, to making this massive machine, which is a feature film?
Well, it was a strange and winding road through my 20s. Filmmaking was so expensive then. I mean, now digital technology is much, much cheaper, but even to make a short film costs at least some money. So to learn to be a director, to get the flying hours, which is all that you need in any medium, is to get those 10,000 hours before you can even call yourself a filmmaker, was to work in parallel media. So working in dance, working in music, working in the live arts, things that were cheaper where one could get the practice, learn how to work with people, learn how to collaborate, learn how to work with space, time, form, and so on. And I think to be a director, you have to know a little bit at least about every aspect of the medium and about every job that you're later going to be asking other people to do. So indeed, I shot things and wrote them and performed in them occasionally, but the transition finally to making a first feature was because I'd made a short that had some success in the sense that quite a lot of people saw it, called Thriller, and which broke some new ground, and that gave the British Film Institute at the time the confidence to support me to make a first feature.
To make a first feature in 1982 as a woman, was that more difficult than it would be now? What do you think? Was that a difficult time for a woman to make a first film in the early 80s?
It was definitely unusual and not easy. I probably didn't make it any easier for myself by deciding to therefore also have an entirely female crew. That was a political act to make a deal with the unions to allow into what had been a closed shop women in every grade of filmmaking. So for me it was an important thing to do, possibly somewhat self-sabotaging, as it meant that the majority of the crew had never been on a film set before. But that was part of that era of idealistic filmmaking, and along with that idealism and the belief that how you make things is as important as the final result. The process is itself political in some sense. So for that reason, for example, every member of the crew was paid exactly the same daily rate, as was I, as was Julie Christie, who was in it. And so this that was part and parcel of the entire project.
Did you encounter hostility from the men in the sheepskin coats who used to run the film industry through the 70s?
I experienced extreme critical hostility of a kind that wouldn't dare to show its face now. There was at the time a television critic called Barry Norman who said, and unfortunately I can still quote it to this day, that a woman has made a film is, as Dr. Johnson said about the dog that can walk on its hind legs. Not exceptional that it happens at all, but not exceptional. He misquoted it in some way, but it was something somebody would not dare to say now, I think, at all. So I think there was a feeling that one had to, in a way, as a woman, push your way into a zone where you would be inherently not welcome, and nevertheless push open that gate. And then there was this feeling that if you did push open the gate, others would trample over you in a rush to get through. But that's the role of going through the gate in some way.
And have you always felt that you wanted to go on doing that? I mean, it never seems to me that you've taken an easy choice in terms of subject matter or a way of treating subject matter. I mean, let's move on, if we can, to Orlando, which took you, I think, 4 years?
7.
7 years to 7 years to set up. It was thought, as you said earlier on, unfilmable. What made you think that you could solve that problem, as you evidently have done with the film? I mean, what was it that gave you the confidence, and what was the process that you went through to find a way of turning that extraordinary book into a film?
I think, like anyone else, I had a mixture of excruciating self-doubt, terror that I would not pull it off, but inside that somewhere, wrapped up in that, inside that doubt, cocoon of doubt, there was a core of absolute sort of certainty that I could do it, because when I sat alone in a room and imagined it, I could watch the finished film. And that was my principle, the principle that I discovered actually of screenwriting. You don't make it, you don't sort of make it, you watch it and write down what you see, and you refine that process more and more and more until there is an absolutely clear relationship between what you're writing on the page and this film that you can watch in your mind's eye. So the fact that I could see it, it just felt like, well, it's only a matter of time before I'll get it onto the screen, but that meant being really kind of bloody-minded over a very long period of time, and even when things like the whole film had been set up to be shot in Russia, and then there was a coup, so we couldn't even fly there. I mean, endless obstacles, but I learned that each obstacle in the journey of a film, and there always are many obstacles, presents an opportunity to refine your original vision. And if you take that philosophical approach, there's no downside. You make it now, to the best of your ability, you make it later, maybe better.
Well, let's look at the first clip, which is clearly early on in the film. It's shot at, I'm not sure it's shot actually, it's the ice skating sequence. That's
shot in Russia.
Shot in Russia.
On the frozen sea, St. Petersburg.
The character played by Tilda Swinton, who is, I'm sure to all of you, easily recognisable, is at this stage in the film a man, turns into a woman in the late 17th century, no, late 18th century, I think. So that's one of the conceits of the book, and one of the things that made it particularly difficult to film. But something you mentioned earlier, the extraordinary attention to detail that goes into making a film, shows itself, I think, in this particular clip. Now, fingers crossed. Can we have the first clip, please?
No brother? No sister? You, Sasha? I wouldn't be here. My father only has me.
Because I'm a master slave, separate melancholy from happy. Why are you sad? Because I can't bear this happiness to end.
That line, I can't bear this happiness to end, is almost like the leitmotif of the film, sort of three-quarters of the way through, whenever Orlando, in either sex, either gender, approaches happiness, it's always snatched away because she wants it too much. Do you think that is what the film said to me when I rewatched it last week? Do you think that's true?
Well, when I was working on it over such a long period, I came to the conclusion that the book, and therefore the film, really was a study of impermanence in all things, including relationships. So when you're clinging to it, it eludes you. And it's really a study of that subject.
Let me ask you quite a different tack, something about the music in that scene, which comes in at the end of the scene. You have a perfect costumed drama, but a very modern piece of music set over it. Did you compose the music for Orlando?
Yes.
Yes. Was that intentional, that slight sense of dissonance, if you like, between the music track and what you would expect, lutes and tall boys and all the usual medievals?
I never thought of it as a period film or a costume drama, in fact, but as simply us travelling in the present time of Orlando through time until we finally arrive sort of ecstatically with this sort of burst of energy in the present moment. That's what Virginia Woolf did in the book. And so the music, to me, it felt entirely appropriate to have, in a way, the sensibility of a modern ear in it, although I think it's slightly hard to place too.
But I mean, you do a similar thing in The Man Who Cried. You bring together different sorts of music because they have, for you, it seems to me, an emotional continuity, an emotional similarity with one another, which wouldn't be immediately apparent to somebody going into a record store and trying to buy, Puccini or gypsy music or whatever. Is that very much the way you see music in films, in creating a particular emotion?
No, sometimes, but I find it more interesting for music at times to be a kind of counterpoint to the image. So it sets up, if you like, a conversation between what you see and what you hear. And then with Ginger and Rosa, I moved in a way away from the notion of a score altogether, and just used music that the characters were listening to in the scenes.
Just one more question on Orlando. And by the way, if any of you have questions you want to ask as we continue up here, please wave your hand. I will look out constantly over the audience. We have a travelling microphone somewhere, so that, and if you need to ask questions in Spanish, that will be translated for Sally. Orlando looks to have been an enormously expensive film, but clearly, given the setting up and the difficulties of setting it up, probably wasn't nearly as expensive as it looks.
It was originally budgeted at being impossible to do for anything less than $30 million, which at the time was a great deal, but we eventually made it for $4 million by ingenious producing decisions, actually, and Christopher Shepard, who produced it, is at the back there, but he, I think, went 30 times to the Soviet Union to find different ways of trying to set up co-production deals and so on, and then it became a quite complex European co-production, in fact. But the key to it was that we were at a historical moment where it was possible to shoot quite a lot of it in Russia and in Uzbekistan.
It was, as you say, a certain moment in English cinema when there was an opening up towards European co-production through the European Co-Production Fund.
Well, I think it was the first European co-production.
I think it probably, yes. So you set a trend for the de-insularization of British film, for which I think we should be very grateful to you.
Thank you, but I think others have done it before. I think Alexander Korda did that in the great studio system and made collaborations between East Europe and West, for example, with Powell Pressburger. But I hope that in some way it was following, at least in those footsteps, yes.
In case anyone should have been watching the red carpet last night, Sally has made quite a few films since Orlando. You were asked a question, I think, on the red carpet. So
what is that?
So we're going to go on to another one which I'm particularly fond of, and I'm interested by what you said about your huge amount of self-doubt and an inner absolute certainty, because that seems to me to exactly describe your character in The Tango Lesson. Somebody who is absolutely sure she can do this, despite everybody telling her, and even the person she's really close to, her partner, telling her, no, you can't do this, you're no good, you're not. Why was it so important to you to make a film about tango? How did that... I know you studied dance, I know you enjoyed choreographing, but where did that story come from, the tango lesson?
Well, actually, while I was making Orlando, which could be considered derived from a book that was, in quotes, highbrow, on the side I was studying ballroom dancing. As at the time what felt to me like a very sort of kitsch antidote, but which also satisfied my needs to be physical whilst I was doing something, so cerebral as script writing. But during that I stumbled across the Argentinian tango and the music, first of all, of Piazzolla, and was devastated by it, and found it struck a deep, deep chord, and I wanted to understand how could the music from another culture, Argentinian culture, so much of its culture, affect me, a woman ostensibly at least from English, so profoundly. What is the relationship of somebody from one culture to another? And that was the first, in a way, driving concept. And when I had been 5 times to Buenos Aires in a year and danced my legs off and my heart out night after night in these clubs all night, really immersed myself in the underworld of the tango at a time when foreigners weren't doing that, I began to find the core of a film idea, in which I thought it would be interesting to put myself in it as the object of a subjective experience who is thinking about making a film about something, and only towards the end of it do we realise that's the film we're watching. So it was that kind of idea.
Stringing this on your side, I'd quite like you to talk us through the clip at the end of it, because I've chosen a clip which it doesn't actually have any tango steps in it at all, but seems to me to some extent have the essence of what you're describing in tango, which is that balance between extreme rigidity and total fluidity.
Well, first of all, I've got no idea what the clip is, but do you want me to talk while it's up there, you mean, afterwards?
Could we have a second clip? put you too much on the spot there? Or?
No, but it is rather embarrassing watching myself actually. Especially kissing. What do you want me to do?
Well, I just... describe the sequence as you conceived it and as you executed it, and why you chose to work on that very recalcitrant form of set. Travelators. Well,
I guess that particular scene was about the inherent movement everywhere. You know, we're surrounded by movement, that everything can become a kind of dance. You know, so Travelators are an obvious example, and it was a scene about saying goodbye, where my character is going off to Hollywood and Pablo is going back to Argentina, I guess. And so I guess it was a kind of playfulness in an everyday, anonymous, modernist setting, really, in which to play out that kind of goodbye.
Before we change century, as it were, and move into the 21st century, does anybody have any questions, any comments they'd like to give to us? Yes, thank you.
I had a question about working with actors, and I wonder if you would talk about your strategies for working with actors, and do they differ when you're working with, say, Tilda Swinton or Elle Fanning, and how you kind of get a performance out of them?
Working with actors is right at the core of what I do, and it's something that I value immensely, more and more. And I have no fixed strategy for how to work with actors. It's extremely individual and specific about trying to find what enables the actor to reach into the very core of themselves and reach into being the kind of actor they want to be, that is consistent with the vision I have for the film as a whole. And the first and most important step, because it would be a very long answer to try and describe all of it, is essentially to make a relationship. Film, when one comes to shoot, is so profoundly collaborative that if you don't get that as a director, you don't get a film. Or you get many films in one, you get something that really is not coherent. With an actor, the first and most important thing is to build trust, because the actor has to deliver themselves into your hands, but it's a mutual kind of trust, it's a kind of interdependent relationship. I try and be the first and best audience that actor will ever have, and I try and look at them with a quality of attention that they won't have received somewhere else, that is so precise and so loving and so respectful that they feel they can kind of expand and not have to try and show something, but can enter into a state of being for the camera that feels very undefended. It's a long subject. As it happens, I've just written a book about working with actors that tries to go into all those details that will be published in sometime early next year.
You were mentioning the idea that the process by which you make a film is important as the product, the film itself. And I was wondering, as you move towards bigger and bigger productions, have you tried to still adhere to that? And what are some of the ways in which, say, you paid attention to that while making Ginger and Rosa?
I think my view of how you put attention on the process has become more subtle and varied than when I started out. It's not so polemical, you know, it's needing necessarily to pay everybody in an equal way, although in Ginger and Rosa, as in many of my other films, actors get paid on a pro rata basis. There's not this incredible kind of hierarchy of payment. And I think what that does partly is it invites the actors to become part of a gift economy rather than a financial economy. They're working because they love to work. Everybody needs to eat also. You know, it's not great to not be able to pay people. But essentially, I think to get the best out of people, you need to draw on and respect their passion for the work or for the working process and draw that out more and more and more. So what I try and do as a précis of an approach to process is to establish an atmosphere in the crew and the cast of the utmost respect for every job, however humble. And at the same time to accept there is a hierarchy of filmmaking. There are heads of departments. They each have their team. But if you set a tone of respect, warmth and respect, and demonstrate that you're prepared to work harder and longer than anyone else, an atmosphere quite swiftly emerges of both kind of collaboration and excitement, because everybody feels that this may be the moment when they're going to do their best life's work. And if you can set that desire up, ignite that desire and work with it in a genuine way, magical things can start to happen. So it's really that. I also do ethically things like I refuse to gossip about anybody. I try and nobody's talking behind anybody's back. Nobody's talking negatively about anybody else. No shaming, no humiliating of people if they do something wrong. All those kind of details that help create a working environment that is both disciplined, focused, and human at the same time.
I'm kind of silence for a moment on that. Can I just take you a bit further back up the process of working with actors, the casting process, because you have made very personal films using quite big name actors. I'm thinking The Man Who Cried. Obviously Johnny Depp wasn't quite Johnny Depp when you made that, but Harry Dean Stanton, Christina Ricci, various other actors, and in Ginger and Rosa, again, you have got an extraordinary selection of actors from both sides of the Atlantic, often playing roles that are not in their natural background dialect. How do you first of all select those actors, and how do you, before you get to this process of collaboration on the set, work with them to discover a character?
I think casting is the single most important decision that you make as a director, I have learnt, because if you get it wrong, everything can go wrong. So I take real time with it, and I do massive, scrupulous amounts of research into the actors that I'm considering working with, and I watch piles of DVDs before I'll even meet an individual actor, so I really know what they might be able to do.
What are you looking for in those piles of DVDs?
I'm looking for a quality that resonates with the part that I'm going to be asking them to play. And because you can't always tell what an actor has given up or what to the film or what the director is asking them to do, you have to look at quite a lot of work to find out what their inherent qualities are. And then I work with casting directors, and then I meet the actors, and I try and establish in that meeting whether not only are they a good fit for the part, but whether there's going to be a productive working relationship, if something's happening between us, if they can, in a way, offer themselves up to me and I can offer myself up to them, what happens in that space between us.
Has it ever happened to you that it hasn't worked out, that you've had to recast somebody because you weren't getting that kind of relationship, that kind of reciprocal sharing?
It happened once to me. I made a mistake in the casting. I'm not going to say who it was, but it was because I didn't listen to my own instinct in the first meeting. Because everybody else thought this person was a great idea, and the small, still voice inside myself that was screaming, no, 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 I put it firmly away in my pocket, and I suffered ever since as a consequence. So I vowed to never, ever do that again, and to never, ever have the control of casting taken away from me.
In The Tango Lesson, there's a very amusing scene set in Hollywood by a swimming pool where you're talking to American money, studio money, about making a film which has to do with a series of murders in the fashion industry, which takes place in Paris, And actually, quite clearly visible on the front page of the script, shown in the film, is the name Rage, which of course is the film that you made 3 years ago. And the advice that they give you is to move it to New York, which actually you did. But you also said you wanted to make it something much more personal. And in a way, the film that you made is quite impersonal in its stylistic approach. It's an almost unique film in the sense that it was premiered on the big screen, on DVD, on mobile phone downloads, all on the same day, which was part of the intention. It's made up entirely of headshots, talking heads. And the clip that we were going to use shows an actress who I think could never let you down, stripping herself emotionally very bare and doing some very brave things for a dame of a certain age, but someone who is, I think, as much up for challenges as you are in films. So if we could just have the third clip, which involves the very wonderful Judi Dench in Rage. Do we have the third clip? Yeah.
Reservations about Merlin's work, serious reservations. He's always had big ideas, but in my view, they were wrong ones. And now I feel Merlin is having his moment. You could say he was a prophet in this age of AIDS and century of terror. His clothes are shrouds. Are you crying, sweetheart? It's better to face up the things as they really are. But the truth hurts. My heart doesn't it?
the ideal choice of words for that makeup, but tell us a little bit about how you did this, how the film was shot, because basically the only thing that changes is the colour of the background. The shot remains essentially the same. Could we stop the clip? Thank you.
The idea was to try and see how far it was possible to tell a story that takes place entirely off screen, outside the frame, as we were discussing earlier, and to work with no sets, just pure colour, and it was shot in front of a green screen, so I did the colour afterwards. I shot it myself, so there was just me, the actor, and the sound recordist at any one moment. The actors never met each other, even though their relationships are intertwined in the story. So it was really about a love of soliloquy and monologue, and an attempt at working with a kind of saturated architecture of pure filmmaking, which also embraced the digital landscape instead of being afraid of it, because there was a great deal of talk at the time about, the digital world was going to kill cinema, and mobile phones were going to kill this, and blah 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 blah. And I thought instead it would be really interesting to work with it and find it thrilling and sensuous and exciting, and that was what it was about. Interestingly, looking now at that clip, I can see why some people found it challenging, because really everything happens off screen, and you have to therefore exist. You have to exercise your own imagination from clues on the soundtrack whilst studying the landscape of the human face.
And the choice of actors on this, I mean, you have Jude Law in drag, you have a number of extremely good actors. Again, did you work with them in exactly the same way? You sat them down, you talked about what was happening? Because the background story to it is a fairly simple, almost trite one of some murders that take place in a fashion show. Because it's always seemed to me to be also, you talk about soliloquy and the digital era, yes, I take that, but it also seems to me so much to be about the basics of acting, the kind of acting that an actor has to do when there's, well, perhaps not quite true in Jude Law's case, he does hide behind a lot of makeup, but when there's nothing to hide from, and nobody to hide from, because you're, after all, right in front of them there, poking the camera at them.
Well, the first thing that actors respond to is a script. Actors, in my experience, are the best readers of scripts of anyone, because what they're looking for always is subtext, hidden in the text that they're going to speak. And so if they see that and they find that, they get excited. In this case, that was what each of these actors first responded to, was the writing. They really were excited about the writing, and then they knew it was going to place enormous and challenging demands on them as actors, because there were going to be no internal edits, only them at any one moment on the screen. So often a feat of memory, because they were quite long monologues, and exposure. So I talked with each of them a lot about how to achieve this quality of transparency, really, in the acting, and we took it from there.
You didn't clearly shoot it on a mobile phone. I mean,
no, I could have now. If I'd been shooting it now, I could have, but at the time the lenses were just not, everything would break up digitally. So I shot it on a domestic digital, but a high grade, and then transferred it.
Do you feel that the digital innovation, the digital movement has changed everything as far as cinema is concerned, or is it, and you say you wanted to go with it to show the things that it could do, as opposed to pretend it wasn't there, but it's something you have to work with?
It's changed the means of production to some degree. It's offered opportunity to young filmmakers to simply pick up their phones and do it. So no more excuses, in a way. What it hasn't changed is how extremely difficult it is to do something worth doing. and how to get good at it, and how to have an idea that will endure, that's worthy. So there's it's created a climate of too muchness, too many images and too many similar images and kind of digital cliches. But I think the possibilities and what it offers far outweigh those stumbling blocks.
Was that the first film you shot digitally?
Yeah, it probably was. Apart from I made a lot of tiny digital films.
And Ginger and Rose, it was also shot digitally?
It was, yes.
And all your films will, in future, be shot digitally?
Not necessarily, but I think it's about what's appropriate for each individual film. And I always do a battery of tests of a range of cameras and a range of medium to really try and find the necessary format for the subject to work with.
It seems to me that someone must also be interested in the technology of filmmaking. Is that true of you? Are you a camera nut as well as a dance nut and an acting nut?
I'm not sure about a nut, but I'm fascinated by what the everything offers. But because I work now a lot through the work of others, through my collaborators, I have a less hands-on geekiness than I might once have had. I'm not sure how you translate geekiness, but I want to know. Yes, I want to know and to push whatever the medium is as far as it can go and find out what it will offer. I'm excited by it.
Is it a different form of excitement than working on 35mm?
No, because I think essentially the passion is simply a love of the moving image, the integration of sound and image, the experience of making something which has a shape that draws on so many lineages. When I say lineages, I mean the theatrical lineage, the literary lineage. Filmmaking is such a mongrel art form that munches, ravenously on every other form that's gone before, and I think therefore it's entirely appropriate that it continues to advance, but that one needs to have a relationship of hunger and desire with each new advance, and not one of resistance and inflexibility.
But you mentioned it, the ease of filmmaking hasn't removed the problem of finding something decent to say. But are you at all worried by that other side effect of the digital era, that we seem to be losing sight of film as a discrete unit and to be gradually immersed in a series of images which we pick up and put down, which are sort of all over our lives? The concentration that we need to sit and watch a film for 90 minutes or 2 hours is being sapped by the easiness of consuming images.
I don't think it is being sapped.
Good.
I think it could be the opposite. I think that people could be developing a different kind of attention span. After all, many young people have the capacity to sit at their computers for 11 or 12 hours at a stretch. That takes some focus. It's not just addictive absorbing of rubbish. But I think it also puts greater responsibility on people who are making films, whether they're digitally generated or not, to work with ever more, in a way, precision, focus and subtlety, so that we go against the numbing effect of too muchness and become more saturated with precision and passion and subtlety at any moment. So kind of use the medium as a sensitizing medium rather than a battering ram.
So that's almost back to where we started talking about engaging the audience in an act of complicity, engaging the viewer in an act of complicity with the moving image and the sound image. It's like this is where we came in, almost, where you were initially started talking about the pleasure you took in making films, and drawing the nature of the filmmaking and making it explicit and making the audience work with that.
Or just trying to have a conversation with an audience in multiple ways, because the film may exist in some platonic sense when it's not watched, but basically it comes to life when it is watched. And so that is the dynamic.
Speaking of the audience, do we have any more questions before we... Yes.
Talking about a relationship, in a certain way you are a dancer, a choreographer, a performer, still across the screen, but how is your relationship or creative process with the dance nowadays?
Relationship with what?
With the dance.
With dance?
With dance nowadays.
I think that the dancer's life is an arduous one, and it's the hardest taskmaster of discipline that I know, and I sometimes say, and probably really think, that it was learning to dance taught me how to become a director, because you learn that you only get better at it by working at it every day in a slow, focused, disciplined way with all your being and with total commitment. And I think people often deify these nebulous ideas like talent or being gifted or something. What really counts is application and work, and dancers know how to work. So that stayed with me. And the other thing I think is a feeling for movement. And one of the great theorists in this area, André Bazin, said that the essence of film is movement. You're constantly making choices and decisions based on movement or stillness. It's cousin. And about where to put the camera. Is it moving? Is it still? Are the characters moving? If so, in what way? Left to right, forward, back, and all those decisions are choreographic decisions. So a dancer's training is very useful in that regard. And I still like dancing.
Okay, well, Sally, thank you. I hope you... I will thank them.
So is that it from them? Is our time up? We've been given the cut.
So,
okay.
What I was about to say was I hope you never lose that passion for discovering and for exploring and for not accepting the easy solution to problems of filmmaking. I'd like to thank you all for coming out this afternoon. I'd like to thank the people behind who we've have served us wonderfully, and Morelia for allowing us to have this discussion with you. Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much.